So now we are live. Let me just share the link with my team. Yes, and here we are. Hi and welcome everybody to the ISP Insights podcast. I'm your host, Thorsten Schmidt. Today I'm glad to have Matthew Polka with me in the show. Matthew is the CEO and president of ACA Connects, the American Cable Associates, representing a group of over 800 ISPs in America. And today, Matthew, we will speak about the topic net neutrality, a topic which is very important and which has a huge influence on many different aspects. So one aspect which we will discuss is, will the internet stay free? How will operators earn money in the future? And many experts are saying that the rise of Silicon Valley and the entire tech industry is highly based on net neutrality. So we will cover this as well. And then we will talk about the different stakeholders. Here are many stakeholders involved, many aspects to talk about. And politics, of course, is also an important aspect here. In the US, the back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. I would be very interesting to learn more about this. There is a new boss at the FCC. I think is also interesting here to speak about. And Matthew, in the end, I will ask you an imaginary question, like imagine we will be reborn in 100 years. And in which world would you like to live, in a world with or without net neutrality? But prior to this and starting, I've talked a lot. Matthew, first of all, to all the listeners who do not know you, who are you?
Well, Thorsten, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great to be here, and so nice that we were able to get introduced via LinkedIn. And I found what you've done to be such a great service to people, not only through Europe, but also across the world in terms of providing information about these important topics. Because as we like to say at ACA Connects, what our members do and what we do best is connect and communicate. That's our job as internet service providers, is to connect with our customers, our communities, to give them access literally to the world. And that's what we do through our investment in broadband in many rural areas. For me personally, I've been quote unquote a cable guy since 1986. I came out of law school in the Pittsburgh area. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, even though I work in Washington, D.C., basically. But I came out of law school in Pittsburgh in 1986, and I started to work representing cable television clients. So I started to learn the cable industry. This is way before broadband, but I started to learn this industry way back when, actually representing smaller independent companies, which is the makeup of our membership at ACA Connects, America's Communications Association. So from an early time, I got to understand as a practicing lawyer what it's like for small businesses where there is much less density. And there I'm talking about providers that typically have 20 homes per mile or less, not 20 customers, but 20 homes per mile or less, compared to what we see in urban areas where literally there could be hundreds and hundreds of homes per mile.
Yeah.
So the ability to provide service in those markets is unique and needs to be treated and understood uniquely by way of regulation, legislation, oversight, et cetera. But I was a practicing lawyer for 4 years working with cable clients. After 4 years, I became general counsel of a small cable company that was based in Pittsburgh. We had about 80,000 subscribers in several states. Again, typical, very rural, low density areas, where I was in charge of all of the legal aspects of the corporation, regulatory compliance from a Federal Communications Commission perspective, as well as human resources, you name it. I covered it all. But during that time, so I was a practicing lawyer from 1986 to 1990. During my time as general counsel of this company from 1990 to 1997, in 1992, our Congress re-regulated our industry. Actually, in 1984, Congress deregulated the industry, meaning that cable operators were no longer necessarily subject to franchise regulation, rate regulation, from local municipal governments who could regulate our rates. But to encourage the industry in 1984 for growth, this industry was deregulated. However, after 6 years, because of changes in political administrations, et cetera, our industry was re-regulated, where rate regulation was reimposed, and our growth, because of the imposition of heavy regulations, had a disproportionate impact on my company as a small business and hundreds of others in our country. So what my company and I did, working with about 150 to 200 other companies, is we created this association then in 1993 to really represent and create an independent voice for these smaller independent companies who frankly are different than the large providers in our country. The impact of rate regulation and regulation in general is a lot different on a company with 20 homes a mile, where it costs the same amount of regulation per mile than it does for a company that has hundreds and hundreds of customers per mile. So we created this independent voice, this volunteer organization in 1993. I remained active. I started to lobby to go to Washington, to work with our Congress, to work with our Federal Communications Commission, to work with the presidential administrations, to be an advocate for our members. And we did this as a volunteer organization for 4 years. And then we decided after 4 years to really make an impact in Washington, D.C. on these issues. You can't do it part-time. You have to do it full-time. You have to put your feet in the ground and say, we are going to be part of being a voice in Washington for forever, for the long term. And so we looked, I was on the board, we looked for someone to run the association from Washington. We didn't have a lot of money at the time as an organization, couldn't really find anybody. So the board came to me as someone who's practiced in the industry, had experience, now in Washington, knows the issues, and they said, would you do that? And I've been honored ever since May of '97 to be the president and CEO of this organization, and we continue to function today. We're much bigger than we were when we started. We've learned a lot over the last nearly 30 years, but we have planted our feet in Washington to do the right things for our members, and that's what we do today as their chief advocate, delivering high impact advocacy and support for our membership.
Yeah. Matthew, can you give me an example how the small operators were impacted, like back in the days when the ACA Connect started? Like you mentioned that the small operators having less homes. What was how can I imagine like how does it feel? So what was the
yeah? Well,
problem?
let me give you an example. I was still with my company at the time, but this was after Congress had re-regulated the industry, and they sent to the FCC basically the requirement to develop regulations to be implemented. So Congress passed the law to re-regulate us. The FCC then implemented the regulations. I was general counsel of my company at the time, but involved in these Washington issues. We decided that what we need to do is we need to go out to every one of our local franchise communities. Mm-hmm. So I went to 7 or 8 states with our team, and we literally showed them the stack of regulations that was at least 1.5 feet thick, almost 18 inches thick of regulations that I plopped down on the table in front of them to say, you figure this out. We're trying to figure it out. We barely can as a small company. How are you as a small municipality going to figure this out? Let's work together to meet the needs of our community. But also in that illustration, what we were able to achieve after a short period of time after we created our organization was a realization that you can't have regulations that thick that applies to larger companies, larger cable companies that have tens of millions of customers compared to companies that have just a couple of hundred or 1,000. And as a result of that activity, the FCC within a couple of years created specific rules that applied to our member companies, taking into account the disproportionate impact of regulation. And within a few years, within 4 years of the time we were re-regulated, Congress actually deregulated once again smaller businesses because they determined that it was better to encourage the growth and development of small companies rather than to really almost put them out of the business because of the heavy burden of regulation.
Yeah. What I totally appreciate, especially in the US, is that there are many smaller operators and mid-sized operators, which is really entrepreneurial-driven business. And it's very important. You mentioned the big papers that you have to meet as an operator, the many regulation laws. And I really appreciate the work that ACA that you are doing here to help the smaller operators and the mid-sized companies to be part of this game. So this is a very important topic. Matthew.
Yeah, let me just add something too, because you mentioned a key word about our members, and that is their entrepreneurial nature, their entrepreneurial spirit. In our membership, we literally have the company that created the cable television industry in the United States.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Service Electric Cablevision, and the family that started this industry. In addition, we have in our membership companies that literally created the first cable television in their states, in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oregon. You know, these are truly companies that met a need that they created something that to meet a need because signals weren't available, that they could create this cable television business, this industry. And because of their entrepreneurial spirit, because of their investment, these companies today, and I'm talking about 800 member companies, we represent about 10 million broadband subscribers. We're in all 50 states. We're in a number of the territories. We're primarily in smaller markets, rural areas. These companies today, because of what they did to literally identify a need to go up to the top of a mountain, to build a tower, to put up an antenna and to run a wire from that antenna down to a television down in the valley. That literally was the spark that created the broadband industry that exists today. Our members started that. And that's what we're taking advantage of today as you and I are talking, me here in Western Pennsylvania in the United States and yourself in Germany. Okay, that's what we created. And that's what small independent companies with an incredible entrepreneurial spirit are able to continue to do today because of their ability to innovate and invest and deploy and to meet the needs of their community. So it's a terrific story. And if you can't tell, I am inspired by our members and what they do. And I love to tell their story because it's not a story that's told enough.
Yeah, definitely. And many different businesses are influencing this topic. So the big rise, like we talked about in the introduction of Silicon Valley and all the tech industry, would not be this successful if America and also
wouldn't exist.
European
Wouldn't exist.
Didn't have access to the internet. So this is really great. And we talked like in our last call, Matthew, a little bit about the background of my grandfather, who is also like a cable operator starting more than 40 years ago. Like you mentioned, really searching the best hill in the area and then building a big tower, and really entrepreneurial spirit with a lot of risks involved. So I can feel I had a big smile while you're talking about these kind of starter spirit. So this is really amazing. So
your
Matthew,
grandfather would be a charter member of ACA Connects. He is the kind of person why this organization exists. And he's just a perfect example of who our members are today. Someone who identified a need, met it, and built a company to serve customers and communities.
Yeah, Matthew. Maybe a personal question. Your workday. Can you give me an example how your workday looks like? Maybe prior to Corona, and now I guess prior to Corona, you told you've been many times to Washington. So
yes,
it's approximately 4 hours I saw by car between Pittsburgh and Washington.
That's exactly right. So I'm here at home, where I've pretty much been ever since March of last year. My last trip to Washington, D.C., where I visit with members of Congress, with our staff, with the Federal Communications Commission. My last trip to D.C. was in late February of 2020. Haven't been there since. Doesn't mean we haven't been in contact because of things like this that, once again, the internet creates. we are in contact each and every day. In fact, right before this call, I just got off of a Zoom call with a staff from the FCC and a commissioner there. So we're in touch all of the time. But yes, before COVID, a lot of my work was in person, with personal lobbying, with personal visits, taking the time to meet with members of Congress, their staffs, the FCC. Now my workday is pretty much here at home, but it's still doing the same thing, where we're talking with Washington every day about issues they're working on, about the nature of committee work going forward as our new committees are forming with the new administration, the new Congress, what the agendas are ahead, working with the new FCC on ongoing issues as well as their broader policy going forward. We spend a lot of time, and I spend a lot of time with our staff, because we feel like we have several important aspects of what we do for our members. One is to be their best advocate on issues relative to Washington, D.C. We want to be their voice, and that's why we call ourselves, with our mission, the premier association delivering high impact advocacy and support. That's our job, to be their voice. So advocacy is one. Education is another. This industry, because now we're no longer just cable video providers, but we're cable providers, we're phone providers, we're broadband providers, is so complicated in terms of oversight, regulation, processes, procedures, operations, compliance, that we spend a great deal of our time as a team through webinars, advisories, calls with members, Zooms like this, where we can share with our members things that they need to know, okay? So it's advocacy, education, and it's also communication. We are working, particularly now in this COVID pandemic world we live in, to take advantage of what we do digitally to better tell our members' story, particularly with what they've accomplished over the last year, when literally in March, tens of millions of people left their offices, left their classrooms, left their healthcare facilities, and went home to work, all relying on a broadband pipe to help them connect and communicate. And we tell that story about the great things that our members were able to do to meet this need, as they connected and communicated, really because of the ability that they had to invest and innovate and deploy. So that's really what we do. And my work hasn't changed. We've been very fortunate as an organization to be able to function every day without really missing many beats at all. We do miss spending time with our members. I think that's one of the joys that I have, certainly within our membership. As I said before, they inspire me. I mean, just to see that what they do in such remote places, and I can tell you, I've been to places all across our country. This is a big, remote, rural country, way more rural areas than urban areas. And to see what our members are doing to serve literally just a handful, less than 5 customers per mile, and what it takes for them to build that and then continue to service it. I mean, it's incredible, and it's a wonderful story. So I do miss seeing them. I do miss getting out and telling that story, but that's what we're trying to do virtually, to make sure that Congress and the FCC in Washington understands how important these companies are to meeting the broadband need in our country today.
Yeah, definitely. I can agree on this. I mean, meeting people in person and drinking beer or coffee is really important. And I also miss this, like in the pandemic time. I mean, what for me is interesting to notice is that it creates a huge efficiency if you don't have to travel a lot. So I'm impressed how many topics I can schedule in my calendar from week to week when I not need to travel. So
Correct.
this is maybe a good learning, and I guess in the US it's also.
Yes.
So this is great. So, but I'm really looking forward, if the pandemic is ending, that we can make a combination of the new learning work style and the
exactly
meeting in person. And
what we do today is going to continue. I mean, I think that there will be aspects of this digital world now we live in that will continue. But hopefully, as vaccines spread across the world, basically, and more people are vaccinated, we will be able to get back to visit and to meet and to really take that important time where you can really build relationships in face-to-face meetings and to really understand people and circumstances better. So hopefully we'll have the best of both worlds going forward.
Yeah. Matthew, let's talk about the stakeholders involved in the topic net neutrality. So we already covered the smaller operators. Let's talk a little bit about the bigger ones. What is the difference between the smaller and the bigger ones? Are there any difference, or?
Well, from the standpoint of regulation of internet service providers through direct net neutrality regulation, in this case, certainly in our country, you have agreement between smaller internet service providers and larger internet service providers that imposition of regulation on internet service providers it has not been demonstrated to be the best course to encourage greater growth and deployment of broadband in our country. And the reason I say that is because our members as smaller ISPs and even the larger ISPs agree. We can look back and to say that our industry as internet service providers, we've invested close to $1 trillion, at least $750 billion, and certainly, more since these figures, have been researched to build robust, high-performance broadband networks throughout our country. We didn't need to be incented to do that. We wanted to do it. As I said, we created this industry. We created this, and we want to make it available because people can find ways to work, learn, be seen by their healthcare officials and doctors and others. We have every incentive to want to invest, innovate, and deploy. And in fact, we've done that. I mean, the fact that there is an industry even to be considered to be regulated is because our companies, as well as others, were entrepreneurial enough to create it and to build it and to distribute it. So we think that what has been proven to be true is that investment through a light touch of regulation has encouraged more investment and deployment of internet service today, where we're seeing average fixed broadband speeds increasing in urban as well as rural areas. Even our member companies, I mean, the minimum speeds that you typically see in some of the most remote areas are at least 100 megabits downstream, which is pretty lightning fast in some of these very remote areas. But you can look across even our membership at, typical 1 gig download speeds in very remote rural areas, and that's because of the nature of investment, where 85 to 90% of all Americans today have access to that robust, high-speed broadband availability and signal because of the fact that we've invested and innovated. So our industry itself would say to really anybody, look, allow us to continue to invest and we will meet the need. We will be your partner in meeting these needs in urban areas as well as in rural areas, because that's what we're here to do. On the other hand, I will say that we as an industry recognize, as I said before, that there are lots of challenges. From our perspective, as I said, it's a big country. There is a lot of territory out there. There's a lot of square miles that don't have access to broadband service as robust as it should be. And we have to find ways to work together, private industry, as well as the public sector in government, to find ways to fill those gaps. The same is true in urban areas. Broadband service may be ubiquitous in a city where I live, like Pittsburgh or New York or Chicago. I mean, a broadband signal through either wireless or wireline will be, everywhere. It's ubiquitous. But you have to focus on certain constituencies, that might have trouble actually obtaining it, whether it's low income families, whether or not they have problems, not just with a broadband wire going by their house, but even being able to afford the equipment, whether it's an iPad or a laptop or something like that. So there are identified needs here in our country that I consider to be broadband gaps, that we think the better course is for the public sector in government to work with our members and industry to find ways to solve those gaps, rather than to have this enormous debate over the imposition of net neutrality, which I think in many ways, in my view, has been demonstrated not to really be effective, because here's what I would say. 4 years ago, the regulations that were previously imposed, that imposed net neutrality regulation, Title II common carrier regulation on internet service providers, those regulations were repealed. What happened as a result of the repeal of those regulations was was the largest boom in broadband investment in one short period of time that our country has seen, to such a point that because of all of that investment that occurred through those 4 years, our country was able to meet that need, that broadband need, when the pandemic hit and tens of millions of customers, tens of millions of people went home. Okay. If we had not been able to meet that, to invest, innovate, and deploy because of that lighter touch of regulation, the story here in our country would not have been the same as it was, frankly, in Europe, where during the pandemic, there were many publicized huge headlines where wasn't it the EU that had to request, for instance, Netflix to throttle down to SD speed because of the increased bandwidth usage, et cetera, like that. And here's the reason why the two circumstances are different. In Europe, my understanding is there certainly is greater regulation of internet service providers, which perhaps led to exactly that request for Netflix to throttle down. In our country, it was different. And during the time of the pandemic and the time leading up to the pandemic, I think the reason why our country did not have a shortage of broadband availability was because internet service providers were able to invest per customer at least 2 times more than internet service providers were able to invest in Europe because of the cost of regulation. And I've seen this firsthand as well, because here for smaller businesses, the impact of regulation has a great causal effect on the ability of a small company to obtain financing, to obtain money to actually invest and deploy. And what we saw before these net neutrality rules in our country were repealed was, and they were actually ready to be imposed on smaller operators, what we saw, and we documented to the FCC, was the threat alone of regulation on internet service providers, particularly rate regulation, caused the financial markets that our members typically would turn to for financing, whether this is direct equity, whether this is bank financing, through other financing, it all dried up. And what programs and plans were on the books to deploy more broadband actually went away. So in something that I think was completely ironic to those who supported net neutrality regulation, the imposition of regulation didn't create more investment, it actually created less. And what we see today as a result of the fact that these rules were repealed is the internet didn't collapse. We didn't start to see gatekeepers. We didn't see discrimination. We didn't see other barriers to access to broadband, but rather just the opposite. As ISPs had the incentive to invest more and to make more available to meet the need when it was so important for our country to have it, that broadband connection, once the pandemic hit last March.
Yeah. Matthew, you already mentioned Netflix and the big companies, and you also said like throttling the bandwidth or blocking the bandwidth. So interesting for me to understand here in this aspect is how is the position of the big operators? I mean, there's also the discussion going on that Netflix should pay big operators for having assured bandwidth and these kind of topics. I'm not an expert in lawyer in the EU or in Germany, so I cannot really speak about the discussion here. But what I understand from my perspective is that in the EU, so blocking and also lowering the speed limitations is not allowed so far. But I would love to discuss the different standpoints between like the big companies, Netflix and Google and all other content providers probably. And many operators are saying they have to pay us that they can use our bandwidth. How is the discussion in the US, and
Sure.
what is this about?
Well, let me start first. The essence of net neutrality,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not talking here about common carrier regulation under Title II in our country or other things like that. But the essence of net neutrality is no blocking, no throttling, no discrimination, no paid prioritization. Those are the key points. Okay. These are points that our members, as well as others in our industry, have already agreed to. We would support, and we have supported, legislation in our country that would provide that net neutrality compromise to say that internet service providers can't block, throttle, discriminate, or engage in any kind of commercial paid prioritization. We would do that today, okay? Because that's the right thing to do. And we have no incentive to block, throttle, discriminate in any way. We want consumers to be able to go anywhere they lawfully can on the internet using our wire, and we're happy to make that available to them. The difference here, however, is in this country, the discussion about application of net neutrality is really just on one side of the pipe. It's really just focused on internet service providers, when so-called edge providers, that's what they call them here in this country, those that work on the edge of the internet, whether it is Google or Amazon or Apple or Netflix or those others, they're not bound by the same kinds of standards or ideas or even thoughts about regulation. So it creates an imbalance in the marketplace where ISPs, we're agreeing. We say, look, no throttling, no blocking, no discrimination. But the same is not true on the other side. And I think that's what's created many of the issues that have made the headlines here in our country, where we've seen, takedown of apps, takedown of other individuals based on speech, things that we couldn't do, limiting or throttling access to certain sites, things that we couldn't do. So in my view, if we are to have, true access to the internet, free and open access to the internet, we have to be concerned about the growth of these large tech companies in Silicon Valley that are having an increasingly corporate view of the world, where they are able to function almost independently, controlling speech, controlling the markets, controlling what we live and work and do during the day, without any kind of oversight whatsoever. And that's why I think that's become a big issue in our country relative to our election, our recent elections, actions taken by companies where there are claims and allegations that they're not imposing standards fairly, but rather taking positions against one side of a debate versus another. And frankly, I think if we're going to be really smart and sensible about this, then we have to say, look, there have to be some limits on both sides of the pipe. And that refers to blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, discrimination, et cetera. And all of that should be prevented. So I think it's become a fascinating topic here in our country. And I don't necessarily want to get into an esoteric discussion about the First Amendment, but I have heard other people in our country, when they refer to free speech, say, the biggest threats to free speech today are not from limitations imposed by the government, but they are limitations that are imposed by private tech companies, which we're seeing today. And I think that while certainly what big tech has done, hey, I'm a user of it. We're taking advantage today of YouTube, and Google's my homepage, and I'm on social media at Matt at ACA on Twitter and things like that. I take advantage of it because there are good things that can be done by way of communication, sharing, relationship, connection, information. But by the same token, there are some concerns here, and that's why I think this debate about how big is too big has taken place not only in Europe, where I think Europe has been much more aggressive in seeking to regulate Google, Facebook,
Yeah.
Amazon, and others compared to here in this country. So we're a little bit behind, but I think with the new administration that is coming here in our country now, we'll see a much more robust debate about these things.
Yeah. Let me mention that I'm also a big fan of the big companies, of the tech companies like Google, YouTube, Amazon, and so on. So there's this is yeah, they are doing a great job, and these are great stories. And the rise of Silicon Valley, an amazing success story. So there's no question about that. But what I also see is that when it comes to protecting smaller markets or smaller areas or countries which are maybe not this developed and not this aggressive than it is in Silicon Valley, then you have, like, with the global, with the easy access and the fast globalization, you have probably not this good your starting position is not this great like for the big companies, and this is probably something which creates some kind of problems in areas. A great example is, like, I'm living near to the Czech Republic, and interesting to see for me is, like, Czech Republics are, I guess, about 7 to 8 million people, and the German-speaking countries are, I don't know, like Germany, Switzerland, Austria. We are in total, I guess, close to 200 millions. And interesting is to see that in the Czech area, because the country is smaller, there are much more smaller startups which take the market of the Czech Republic, which is a good ecosystem, I would say, because the big tech companies, it was not an attractive market to them, and so they have a chance to develop their own products. And there are many alternatives to the big tech companies because they were not protected by regulation or whatever, but they were just protected because they were so small. So this is, I guess, also some two coins of a medal, that the rise of Silicon Valley and all the tech is amazing, and our life would not be the same without net neutrality. So
Right.
this is, I guess, one important topic, but it creates on the other side the problem which I explained. And the second thing is, I mean, we can compare countries like the US and Germany and European, where the net neutrality is highly, there's probably not much blocking or no blocking, less bandwidth throttling or no bandwidth throttling compared to other countries like China, I guess, is the most popular, making a different approach, like the Great Wall of China, or the Great Firewall of China, called. Yeah, what are your thoughts about this? I mean, China is going a totally different approach. They are also protecting their markets, which probably means there is no, or less open speech, let's call it this way. But compared, on the other hand, it allows companies or smaller businesses to grow and make new markets. But freedom of speech is, from a human rights perspective, so important, and this is why this is. I have no answer here, but this is why the topic for me is so complex. There are so many different aspects and stakeholders.
Well, I would say this. I honestly don't know too much about the broadband market in China, but certainly have read stories about control of networks, things of that nature, which have limited speech, and I think that's a concern. As I mentioned before, with what's happening, in our country with the rise of big tech and the greater size and control that they have, the ability to either encourage or discourage speech. I mean, that's not a good thing. Now, on the other hand, I realize here in our country that these companies are private companies, and private companies in many ways can do what they want to do. But at least from our perspective, I think that there has to be some reasonable form of regulation that creates reasonable rules of the road, for both sides. And that's why I've always thought, and we've favored the notion of basic net neutrality protections that really apply to both sides of the pipe, that ensure that people can connect without fear of being throttled, without being blocked, without being discriminated against, without their speech being shut down, et cetera. And that encourages greater debate, as we've seen. Look how many cases we can look to, around the world where appropriate comments have been made by groups that have been aggrieved, and because of their use of social media, they were able to highlight injustices, which again, I think comes back to how these platforms can be used in such effective and positive ways. But it's different in many countries. I certainly don't like to see speech restricted, because I think that is much more harmful in the long run. And rather, we should have more of a robust debate, because we're better if we can more effectively communicate with each other.
Yeah, definitely, and I totally agree on that. And it's really a question, a society question: how do we want to live, and what are the basic values that
Correct.
Our society provides? And I think freedom of speech, and in this respect, I think the US and the EU are probably really on the same agenda, is very important, and I absolutely appreciate this kind of mindset. And yeah, I think it's interesting that we talk about it. Of course, there's also another problem which comes with it, or probably not just one. But my assumption is also that this is very important. Yeah, Matthew, I would like to speak. We are already in the politics debate. You talked about the deregulation in the beginning, like 40 years ago or 35 years ago. And now there is a switch in government from the Republicans to the Democrats, which creates, of course, a huge. Many people are looking what's going to happen next year. And I saw that the FCC got a new boss, a lady called Jessica Rosenworth. Maybe can you talk a little bit about the difference between the former government and now, and what will this gonna change in the US, or
Sure.
will it change anything? Yeah.
Well, sure. Let me say this first. Since our organization was created back in 1993, we believe that we've worked very hard to work in Washington the right way. And by that, I mean, we have always seen ourselves as a bipartisan group. We are happy, more than happy, and we've demonstrated this over nearly 30 years of working with both Republicans as well as Democrats, whether they were in the majority party or whether they were in the minority, whether they were at the House, in the House, in the Senate, in the administration, at the FCC. Our job is to work on behalf of our members, to find members of Congress, the FCC, the administration, to work together to find solutions. We want to build compromise. We think that that's best for communications policy, for our country, for our citizens, to find people that are willing to work together to solve problems. Now, the political environment in our country has made that much, much more difficult, because of the fact that there's been greater division between, the views of the parties, and more of the reluctance to compromise, where in some ways compromise is oftentimes seen as a bad word, where the idea of working with somebody from another party could be detrimental, because you may end up having somebody run against you in your primary election before you run against someone in the general election. But despite those difficulties, it's still the best way to proceed. And that's what we try to do. And that's what we try to encourage. And pretty much within our sphere, where we are working with, where we're working with members of Congress, particularly in the commerce committees that deal with the majority of this legislation we deal with, and at the FCC, we can find common ground, and we have found common ground to move forward. So that's our goal, first and foremost, to do that. To get more specific to your question, there typically are. I mean, these are general terms, and so I mean, take them for what they are worth. But I don't know in practice that it's always this way. But there's a perception that those in power, from a Democratic perspective, may want to have more regulation compared to Republicans that are said to be more business oriented. The Democrats being more consumer oriented and Republicans being more business oriented. And as a shorthand, okay, maybe you can say that that's correct at a very high level. I do think that there is a difference in philosophy, however, and it usually comes to how regulation can be a tool to achieving certain results. And we talked about this in the nature of net neutrality, where where those in democratic control before sought to impose net neutrality regulations to address specific wrongs. And actually, some of those wrongs that we agreed with, as I said, we don't think there should be blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, et cetera. So it is possible that we might see a tendency towards more regulation, but I'm also hopeful, particularly now with acting chairwoman Rosenworcel. I mean, we've spent a lot of time working with her and her team over the years to demonstrate and illustrate who our members are, as well as the great stories that we've, that our members have achieved. And I know she's very passionate, as she should be, about solving what she calls the homework gap, which she's been focused on really throughout the pandemic. We want to help her solve that problem. And it goes back to what I was saying before about recognizing that this is a big country. There are many, many remote areas where it's hard to serve, and we have to identify those gaps and work together to solve them. And I think schools, libraries, students, low-income families, it's a perfect area, among others, where we can work together to say, what's the specific problem we're trying to solve? And let's solve that problem. And so we're going to try to do that for sure. But the truth is that whenever you deal with change, and I've been working in DC since 1993, and I've seen 5 or 6 administrations change now. No matter what you say, the bottom line is this: there are always some things you're going to like, and there are always some things you're not going to like. And that's just the nature of it. But what you have to do is you have to work together and recognize that we're not always going to agree on every issue, but we're going to agree on a lot of issues, and we're going to work together to find the best solution. And you can count on that, and you can count on us to do that. And I think that that's kind of where we are right now. We look forward to working with the acting chairwoman. I mean, she spoke with our members last September in our annual meeting. She's been, we've been before and vice versa. So she knows us well, and we're looking forward to spending time working with her in the days ahead.
Yeah, great. I think inclusion is really important topic, so that you bring all the stakeholders at one table, and I'm really looking forward what's gonna happen here next. So yeah, stakeholders. Did we miss anyone? We talked about the human rights point. We talked about the big companies, the big tech. We talked about the operators, different, small, and big. Is there anyone which we missed so far?
I think that's the landscape. I mean, I think that's the landscape. There are certainly a number of groups that we actually work with in Washington, D.C. I mean, we are a trade association representing smaller businesses, but there are other associations and groups in Washington that focus on consumer interests, public knowledge, free press, Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America, groups that we've actually visited with, worked with, spent time with over the years, where we haven't always agreed, but again, where many times we have. At the end of the day, it comes back to something that I said at the very beginning, which is we all have a desire for consumers to be able to connect and communicate. That's what we want to help, and we want to give consumers the ability to do. And to me, there is much more benefit in working together to find ways to solve complex problems and to work to find middle ground than there is in creating positions that really separate us and do not allow the opportunity for discussion. We are open as a group to to having those discussions and visiting with any such group to help find solutions going forward, because as I said, it is in every fiber of our members' operations. I mean, it's literally in their DNA as small businesses, just like your grandfathers, to meet a need and to serve the customers in your local community. That's who our members are. They have no reason to want to do anything else but to find ways that they can serve their customers more. And we want to do that. We want to also have the ability to invest and innovate, and as a small business, to be encouraged to do that. But we have every incentive to work with every group every government agency, et cetera, to make sure that we are allowing our customers to connect and communicate.
Yeah, that's great. That's what we call customer first philosophy. So this is really what I
Absolutely.
appreciate, and this is definitely the right way. And I totally agree on that. Matthew, you said also about like the school application, which the FCC probably wants to launch or is already launching. From your expertise, will COVID have more impacts on net neutrality, or is it? I mean, there are huge problems coming to the government. I guess like the financial topic, which will probably be bigger than 2008. And I'm reading the book from Obama now, where he speaks a lot about the crisis 2008 and how dramatic it was. So probably this will be a big part of it. Of what the government needs to face now.
Sure.
Do you see any other topics in respect of the of net neutrality next to school applications, which will maybe the pandemic impact on this or will have an impact on this?
It's possible that we'll deal with net neutrality issues going forward, but I think more immediately, the issue here is one of infrastructure.
Infrastructure topic.
As our country, works to encourage all segments of our country, industry, consumers, residents, to come out of the pandemic even stronger. One important aspect of work is based on funding for more infrastructure.
Yeah.
And now in our country, infrastructure, it used to mean roads, bridges, waterways, things of that nature. But now, because of COVID and the incredibly important, essential need for broadband, we realize that broadband is a critical infrastructure element as well. So as our new Congress goes forward, working with our new president on what could be a very sizable COVID-related infrastructure package, I think a lot of what is in that package will be focused on broadband. And here I'm talking about programs that could focus on schools and libraries, something that we call E-rate, educational rate, et cetera. E-rate school funding that will help, low-income students, low-income families, school district connect, and have support to connect. Schools to be able to create connections to other broader, higher speed networks. Finding ways to finance more of the computer equipment that is necessary for students to have, whether it's iPads or laptops, things of that nature. So, before we get to that broader debate over how the internet should be regulated, I think we'll be seeing more specifically in the first 6 months direct efforts on infrastructure development and funding for broadband that'll cover a lot of areas. I mean, not only schools, telehealth, deployment into unserved areas. We'll talk about lots of different aspects of infrastructure as well.
Yeah. Matthew, do you have any numbers in mind? How many people in the US are probably offline? I mean, I guess internet is in most areas working. It's what I saw. It's more like it's not affordable for some for some people. I also see that even in bigger cities where more poor people are living, that it's not really available. So are there any numbers which you have in mind? How many are unconnected or not affordable?
They vary, but I think most numbers would settle somewhere on around 90% of our citizens are passed by a broadband connection. Now that's a lot. Okay, so 300 some million, so maybe 30 some million maybe not have or not passed by a broadband connection. But again, it comes back to identifying the needs of the group that's not served today. Is it the fact that broadband doesn't pass where they live? And so that becomes, a broadband deployment gap in rural areas where we need to focus on, is this an economic issue in terms of what it costs to build a wireline broadband network, or do we need to use other technology, whether it's wireless, even satellite, to help reach, those people to ensure that they're connected, where the government can help working to identify those needs in those unserved areas and to make us, and to make sure we need them. Secondly, of the people that aren't served today or that aren't connected to broadband, is it an equipment issue, or is it an income issue? And here I think we are talking about a lot in maybe more urban areas where we're talking about low income families and having no access or availability economically to be able to afford these things. How can we identify those communities again that are unserved and work together, public and private, to help meet that need? And I think that the better course is to identify those areas, those gaps, and to look specifically at how we can best serve and meet those needs. And we've already started to do that. I mean, I think that many of the programs that have existed have already been geared to try to target those areas, and our members certainly have done that even on their own as they've gone out to identify community schools that maybe need to have a more robust network, or families that don't have access to broadband, or maybe a higher speed broadband, or equipment that's available. But working together, again, we can identify those segments of our population that aren't served today, find out what the reason is for it, and then create programs that allow for different technologies to help to meet the need.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very, very important work that the government and you have to do here. I mean, 30 million people you mentioned approximately without access to the internet is a lot, and this is very important that they have internet access. I mean, the kind of influence which it have when you don't have access, the negative topics that come with it is really crazy, and the pandemic even makes it more worse here if you don't have access to the internet. And it's there have been a lot of studies about the impact compared no internet and having internet access, and
Sure.
it's really also a topic about economic growth, helping economic growth, and the pandemic even increases this year. So
Yep.
It's a really, really important work, and I'm really looking forward what the government will propose here in the next months. And yeah, Matthew, I think we come to my last question. Do you have anything which you would like to mention?
Well, I would just say in that regard, as we do move forward, it is a difficult time in our country. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to bring groups to work together. And I understand that. We understand this. We as an organization hope to be part of the solution, particularly as we talk about these issues. Not so much the national political issues that seem to be circling all around us, but as we get to work on some of these issues that are part of the jurisdiction of the Commerce Committees as well as the FCC, we're looking forward to be able to demonstrate our commitment to finding solutions that benefit our customers and that encourage our continued investment and deployment. Because again, as you were talking about the importance of internet service available to consumers, we have every incentive to want to make sure that every customer in our service area is served. We want to make sure every customer is served. The fact is that, as I said, it in some cases it's just simply not possible because of how large this country is geographically. But together, I believe we can work with the government to find ways to make sure that every American is connected with a broadband connection.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think? How many years will it take until the US reaches like 99%?
Well, I will say this: it is a challenge. There's no question. It's a challenge. But we have to be dedicated and committed to it, which I believe we are, and we can work together to achieve it. But by way of an example, it's not a program that necessarily has an end date, but rather we just have to be committed to making sure that every customer is served. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by how difficult it is. Way back in, I think it was 1934, 36, something like that. Our government created a program to ensure that every consumer, every person in America had electricity that went by their house, that they had available electricity to their home. Okay. And that was a big task because, again, this is a big country. It was, I saw a statistic, it was something like 24 years later in 1960, after 24 years of this program to fully electrify this country, that there were still 4 to 5 million people that weren't passed by electricity because this country is so big and so remote. You know, there are going to be examples like that too, but over time, we have to work and take that number from what it is today and make it smaller and smaller and smaller until hopefully there's nobody left on the list without a broadband connection.
Yeah, this is great. And to me, it really also feels like the starting spirit, which we spoke in the beginning.
Yes.
When it's probably the same, like getting the last people connected is definitely like starting 40 years ago.
Yes.
So I really appreciate it. And it's very important that the government is supporting it and that cable operators and operators work together and try to get everybody, try to get every human online. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great, Matthew. So let's come to my last question. So it's like I mentioned, a missionary question. So let's assume in 100 years, we both will be reborn and there would be a world like with net neutrality. So which means no blocking, no throttling, nothing. And the other world would be a different scenario where maybe, we talked about it. In which world would you like to live?
Well, here's what I'd say, because it's a fascinating question. Hopefully we can maybe find middle ground. But what I would answer that sort of historically, and to say that, certainly in my lifetime, with the changes that I've seen that have occurred technologically, industrially, et cetera, it's because of an idea that has generated an interest that then has created innovation and investment to deploy. So all of these things that exist today that we take for granted, again, from my perspective, come back to that one company in Eastern Pennsylvania where, one person saw a need and met it. And from that developed a wonderful industry that we take advantage of today. I think that's the essence of what we need. And if we 100 years from now, would wake up and say, okay, what are the technological advancements? I think that you would say that more often than not, those were created by, someone with an entrepreneurial and innovative spirit to meet a need and then invest in it and then create it. So I would probably say, we would have more available to us without heavy regulation. I'm not saying that there isn't a role for regulation. Heck, I live in a regulatory world, but history has shown that it is the entrepreneurial spirit of an individual in a small business that gets the job done over time.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I would like to add that the freedom of speech we talked about is
Yes.
an important topic, which I would really like to see in the world in 100 years. So
Yes.
Definitely very, very important. We always have to imagine that the internet is new if we speak about hundreds of years. And it's probably we are living in the first age where this is like, it seems like normal, but nobody prior to this, no generation prior to this has experienced what's happening now. So this is really, really important and amazing to watch, and hopefully the future goes in this direction. So from our perspective.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So great, Matthew. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. I really enjoy the opportunity, and it's great to meet you. Hope to meet you in person someday.
Yeah, definitely. When COVID is over, we will grab a beer or a coffee in Pittsburgh or Washington. Let's see.
Or in Germany, even.
Or in Germany, yeah.
That's right.
That would also be great. Okay. Thanks,
Well,
Matthew.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and I hope to see you soon. Bye now.
Yeah, bye. Ciao.